For generations, the promise of retirement was pretty simple. You work hard, you pay into the system, and when the time comes, society helps take care of you. But that very promise, really one of the great economic pillars of the last century, is now cracking under its own weight. So let's unpack this global challenge. The scale of this problem, well, it's almost hard to wrap your head around. The World Economic Forum estimates that by the year 2050, the world is going to be facing a $400 trillion gap between what we need for retirement and what we've actually saved. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 4 times the size of the entire global economy today. It's a staggering figure. So, in this explainer, we're going to break down exactly how we got here. We'll start with the broken promise of the old pension models. Then we'll see how this crisis is playing out across the globe. We'll try to understand the political paradox that makes this thing so incredibly hard to solve. And finally, we'll look for a new path forward by looking at some of the countries that might actually be getting it right. So how did this foundational promise fall apart? Well, at the end of the day, it all comes down to some basic math that just doesn't add up anymore. See, most of our pension systems run on what's called a pay-as-you-go model. And this clears up a really common misconception. The money you pay in doesn't just go into a personal savings account with your name on it. Nope. Instead, it goes directly to pay for the people who are retired today. The whole deal is based on the idea that the next generation will then be there to pay for you. And this is exactly why that deal is in trouble. The whole system only works if there are enough workers to support the retirees. Just look at this chart. Back in the 1950s, the U.S. had 16 workers for every single retiree. That's a huge, stable base of contributors. Today, that ratio has completely collapsed to just 2.7 workers. And by 2035, it's expected to drop even further to just 2.3. The reason for that collapse is pretty simple, actually. The world we built these systems for, well, it just doesn't exist anymore. Global life expectancy has soared, which means people are spending way more years in retirement, and at the exact same time, birth rates in nearly every developed country have fallen below the level needed to replace the population. Fewer workers, more retirees, the math is just unforgiving. And look, this isn't just some theoretical problem on a spreadsheet. Let's see how this is actually playing out in major economies around the world, because each one is facing its own unique version of this crisis. In the United States, the immediate threat is insolvency. By 2035, the money coming in will only cover about 83% of the benefits promised. That could trigger an automatic 17% cut for every retiree. In Japan, it's a pure demographic storm. Their working-age population is already shrunk by 13 million people since 1995. For France, it's about the sheer weight of it all, with pensions eating up a massive 14% of their entire economy. And then you have China, which is getting older faster than any country in history and could see its pension fund run totally dry within a decade. And in Japan, you can really see the human side of this crisis. After their economic bubble burst back in the 90s, the country went through what they call an employment ice age. A whole generation of people was locked out of stable careers. They were forced into temporary jobs with no real pension benefits. And now, they're approaching retirement age with almost nothing saved. It's a ticking social time bomb. So you might be wondering, if everyone knows the math is broken, why isn't somebody, fixing it? Well, this brings us to the central paradox of the entire pension crisis. It's because pension reform is what's known as the third rail of politics. You touch it, and your career dies. Leaders from all across the political spectrum promise to protect benefits no matter what. I mean, look at these quotes. Donald Trump and Joe Biden have made almost identical pledges. It just reflects a simple reality. Older voters are the most reliable voters, and they have the most to lose. The problem is, there are really only 3 ways to actually fix the numbers. You either have to ask people to work longer, you have to ask them to pay more in taxes, or you have to tell them they're going to get less in benefits. None of those are popular, and none of them are going to win you an election. And if you want a perfect, real-world example of this political danger, just look at what happened in France. In 2023, the government tried to pass a pretty modest reform, just raising the retirement age by 2 years from 62 to 64. The result? Massive, paralyzing strikes that shut down the country. The public backlash was just immense. But the situation isn't completely hopeless. A few countries have actually managed to escape this political trap by taking a very different approach. So let's look at some of the models that seem to be working. Take Denmark. What they did was actually kind of brilliant. They took the politics right out of the equation. Way back in 2006, they simply announced a rule that ties the retirement age directly to life expectancy. So as people live longer, the age to get benefits goes up automatically. It's predictable, it's transparent, and it gives people decades to plan, which avoids any sudden shocks to the system. Sweden went through an even more radical change back in the 90s, and they created a system that is largely self-correcting. Your benefits are directly tied to what you paid in over your lifetime, and then the final payout automatically adjusts based on things like economic growth and demographic changes. So when the 2008 financial crisis hit, benefits dipped slightly, but the system stayed solvent without any political panic. Now, another path is to shift the burden away from the state and more onto individuals and their employers. Australia's superannuation system is a great example of this. It's basically a mandatory savings plan where employers have to contribute a percentage of an employee's salary into a private retirement account. And the results have been really impressive. It's created this massive pool of over $4 trillion in retirement savings. But it's not a perfect solution. The generous tax breaks they use to encourage all this saving are a huge cost to the government. And the system helps higher income earners way more than it helps low-income workers, who often still have to rely on the public safety net. Other countries are trying more targeted fixes. Some use what's called means testing, which just reduces benefits for wealthier retirees so that resources can be focused on those who need it most. New Zealand has a clever alternative. Everyone gets a pension, but it's treated as regular income, so it's taxed. That means wealthier folks simply pay more of it back to the government. So, what can we learn from all this? When you boil it all down, it really comes to a fundamental choice between dealing with the problem now or waiting for it to become an absolute catastrophe. The single biggest lesson from countries like Sweden and Denmark is that acting early is everything. Gradual, predictable, and transparent changes, they build public trust, and they are so much less painful than these sudden, deep, and drastic cuts that will be necessary if governments wait until their systems are right on the brink of collapse. You know, the numbers here are not a surprise. These demographic shifts have been happening in slow motion, visible for decades. So the ultimate question this leaves us with is a pretty simple one. Since this problem is entirely predictable, are we going to choose the manageable pain of gradual reform now, or are we just going to wait for the devastating shock of a sudden collapse?